Chapter 3. One Good Friend. I don't remember very much about my trip to school. Bessie put me in a coach, gave the driver my destination, and told him to keep an eye on me. I left early in the morning. It was after nightfall when I arrived at the small inn where someone from school was supposed to pick me up. I was cold and hungry, and my body was stiff from the long journey. I kept looking out the window to see who might be walking into the inn, but no one came to fetch me. I had all but given up hope when I saw a carriage drive up the road. It stopped in front of the inn, the door opened, and an older woman dressed like a servant stepped out. "Is there a little girl called Jane Eyre here?" she shouted from the street. "Yes, yes," I yelled. "I'm Jane Eyre." I ran out as fast as I could, afraid that if I didn't get there right away, she would think no one had heard her and would leave. Without saying a word, she helped me climb into the carriage. It was another long journey. For a while, I looked out the window, trying to see the landscape of the area where I would now live, but all I could see was darkness and rain. Soon, lulled by the clopping sound of the horse's hooves, I fell asleep. Next thing I remember is being lifted out of the carriage in someone's arms and put down in front of a large building. It had many windows, but only a few were lit up. A pebble path led to a broad door. Out of it came a woman whose face I could not see in the dark. She walked up to me, took my hand, and led me into the building. "The child is too young to have traveled alone," she said to the servant who had picked me up at the inn. She was a young woman, around 25. She had a sad but kind face, and was wearing a plain dress and a frayed shawl over her shoulders. She told me she was a teacher, and that her name was Miss Miller, then led me through countless corridors to a long, wide room with several large tables in it. It was study hour. 80 girls, from 9 to 20 years old, sat around the tables, each with her head bent over a book. They looked up at me for a second, then back down at their books. They all had pale, drawn faces. Their hair was brushed back, so there was not one loose curl, not one wispy. Stray strand, falling on their foreheads. They were wearing dresses made out of coarse brown material and white starched petticoats. Even the older girls, who were 19 or 20 years old, were wearing petticoats. "Monitors, collect the books and put them away," Miss Miller said. The tallest girls gathered the books and put them on the shelves. "Monitors, bring the dinner trays." On each tray there was a single mug of water and a platter of food. I could not see what kind. The girls took sips of water from the same mug and served themselves small portions of food. When they had finished eating, Miss Miller commanded them to read from their prayer books. Then she commanded them to leave the room. The girls filed out one by one. Miss Miller and I left the room last. We followed the girls up the stairs and into another long, wide room, with 3 long rows of beds. 2 girls slept in a bed. Miss Miller told me that I'd have to share her bed. I was so exhausted that I fell asleep right away and was dead to the world. I woke up to the sound of a loud bell. Most of the girls had already gotten out of bed and were washing up. There were over a dozen basins in the room. Each one had to be shared by 6 girls who, one after another, splashed her face with the same water. I waited my turn, shivering in the cold, then dressed up as quickly as I could. Another bell rang and the girls formed a line, 2 by 2, and marched down the stairs and into a large, dimly lit room. Miss Miller read a prayer, then called out, "Form classes!" The girls separated into groups, and each group sat down at a separate table. There were 4 tables in all, and the girls had to sit down around them in hard, wooden chairs, with their backs ramrod straight. "Silence! Silence!" Miss Miller shouted. Another bell rang, and 3 more teachers walked into the room. Their faces were plain and severe, with tired, solemn eyes and lips pressed tightly. The lessons began. The teachers sat down, one at each table, and for 1 hour we had to read the Bible. Then another bell rang. "Form a line and march to the dining room," Miss Miller said. Everything was done by command, and before each command the bell rang. I had been too exhausted and too nervous to eat anything the night before. Now I was ravenous. I did not need a command to sit down and eat. I couldn't wait. But when the food came, it smelled so awful I could only eat a spoonful. "It tastes disgusting," one of the older girls said. "The porridge is burned again." None of the girls could eat. The teachers tried to set a good example, but they could not finish their portions. We marched back to the classroom with empty stomachs. I was so weak I thought I would faint. We sat around at our tables again and made ready for our lesson. Then the door to the classroom flew open and a tall, beautiful woman walked in. The girls turned their heads and looked at her, and I saw their faces light up with adoration and love. She had a lovely, sweet face, with a high forehead, large brown eyes, and thick hair braided like a crown at the top of her head. She wasn't much older than the other teachers, and she was dressed in similarly plain, frayed clothes, but she carried herself like someone who was used to being respected and obeyed. Later, I found out her name was Miss Temple and that she was the headmistress. She walked to the center of the room. "I have something to say to the students," she said. "I understand that the breakfast was served to you this morning was unfit to eat. I've given orders that a snack of bread and cheese be served to you immediately." The girls cheered. After we ate, another bell rang and classes began. Each lesson lasted an hour. Every hour on the hour, the bell rang and the next lesson began. There was no recess. After the 5th lesson, the bell rang louder and longer. "To the garden," Miss Miller ordered. The girls put on their coats and hats and streamed out the door. I followed, last to leave the class. The garden was fenced in by a stone wall too high to see over. There were several flower beds. No doubt they looked beautiful in the spring, but now they lay bare. The ground was soaking wet because of last night's rain, and the sky was gray. It was misty and cold. I stood shivering against the wall. No one seemed to notice me. I was used to feeling lonely, but I had never felt so alone or so miserable. I was still famished. I was freezing from the cold, and I had no one to talk to. The rest of the girls had broken up into groups and were chatting and laughing. I was beginning to give up hope that I could get close to anyone when I noticed another girl who had sat all alone on the doorsill. She was reading a book. I walked over to her and asked what she was reading. "Oh, it's a novel," she said. She stared thoughtfully at my face. "Are you an orphan?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Both my parents died before I can remember. Why do you ask?" "Most of the girls here are orphans," she said. "All of us are charity cases." "Do you like the teachers?" I asked. "Well enough." "How about Miss Temple?" "I love Miss Temple. She's wonderful." "How long have you been here?" 2 years. "Are you happy here?" "You ask too many questions," the girl said. "I want to read." She looked down at her book, but before she could start reading again, the bell rang. "We have to go back in," she said. "It's time for dinner." Dinner was some kind of stew made from stringy, tough meat and potatoes. The portions were large, but the food tasted so bad that, famished as I was, I could only eat a little. Afterward, we went back to the classroom. The evening lessons went pretty much the way the morning lessons had gone. The only remarkable event was that the girl I had talked to in the garden was punished by the history teacher. She was at my table, so I don't know what she had done wrong. The teacher called out her name, which, it turns out, was Helen Burns, and asked her to stand in the middle of the classroom. Everyone in class turned their heads and stared, but Helen Burns did not seem to mind. Had it been me, I would have wished that the earth opened up and swallow me. Helen Burns did not even blush. There was a faraway look in her eyes, as if she were daydreaming. I wondered about her. She looked to be 13, quite a bit older and taller than I. She had a serious, gentle face. I had liked her earlier. I thought she had been honest and bright. Could she be a bad girl? If not, why was she punished?